Use Ajax, the foaming cleanser.
Alka-Seltzer, plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is.
Double your pleasure, double your fun with double mint gum.
J-E-L-L. Oh, the big red letters stand for the Jello family.
Welcome to Common Point, the show for and about communications. I'm your host, Dan Thomas. My special guest today is Bob Allison. Bob Allison is an engineer with the ARRL, and we'll be explaining that in just a moment. Welcome, Bob. Thanks for sparing your time today to join us on Common Point.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be on your show, Dan. Thank you.
We're going to talk about communications. As I say, that's what the show's about, but specifically amateur radio or amateur radio service. We talked about that earlier, but realistically, what is amateur radio?
Well, amateur radio is a service. It's comprised of volunteers. We call it amateur radio because the people that are involved with amateur radio are not paid. It's not that they lack certain skills or knowledge. On the contrary, they're very, very knowledgeable about electronics. Now, the amateur radio service is, well, you get to talk to people around the world, locally and around the world. And it's a service because in times of emergencies, when all other things fail, there's amateur radio. And one of its purposes is to provide emergency communications. Imagine if the entire infrastructure broke down. That is, no cell phones, no computers, no internet, okay? But there's always radio, and specifically amateur radio. Amateur radio communications is simply this: an operator, a radio, and an antenna, and the exact same thing at the other end. An operator, a radio, and antenna. That's your communication system. So you might think, who needs amateur radio today? We have cell phones, but there have been many instances when cell phone technology is broken down or overloaded, and the only way to pass messages is through amateur radio. And there are other radio services. Well, the police have radios too, and EMTs, but let me tell you a story. Is in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, all the backup systems failed. Police couldn't talk to the fire department couldn't talk to the EMTs. Well, there was amateur radio. And there are many volunteers that are trained exactly in communications, emergency communications, and they're also trained to work with municipalities. So really one of the primary purposes, what is amateur radio? It's emergency communications, but it's a lot of fun.
Yes, and that's a major aspect of it, but there are many, many areas in amateur radio. I got to admit, okay, I'm a ham too.
Well, we call them ham radio operators.
Right.
Yeah.
Bob's a ham, been a ham for many years. I'm a fairly recent joiner of amateur radio. I was a commercial broadcaster for many years. But Bob, this has become part of my life now, and I love it. I love the people I've met. It's exciting. But I hear comments from folks, oh, that's just for old guys. Nobody uses amateur radio anymore.
Oh, doddering elderly men in their basements fooling around with the vacuum tubes.
Right.
No, on the contrary. Well, one of the big events I get to go to as part of the ARL staff is the Dayton Hamvention. That's in Dayton, Ohio. It's in every May. And so you think, well, there's no kids in amateur radio. You should see all the kids running around with their handheld transceivers. They're everywhere. Maybe they're not talking as much, but they are on the air. They're on using digital format. They're actually texting via ham radio. That's what they're doing. Maybe they're not as vocal or invisible, but they're out there. You'll see them at conventions, and they have their own youth groups.
Let's talk a bit about the ARRL. What is the ARRL?
It's the American Radio Relay League, and it's located on Main Street in Newington, Connecticut. So Connecticut's very lucky because they have the National Association for Amateur Radio, the ARRL, right here in Connecticut. So it's really easy to visit. Now, what is the ARRL? Well, it is a group of volunteers, basically, you could call it. The organization has been around for over 100 years. It is run by a board of directors who are all volunteer. The president of the ARRL is a woman, Kay Craigie. She is a volunteer. And so then you kind of trickle down to all the different sections around the United States. You know, the directors, they're in certain divisions like New England, Southwest, Midwest, 11 different divisions. And from each division, they have a section manager, an assistant section manager, an emergency coordinator. Then you have all the volunteers that help out with not just emergency communications, but public events. I'm sure you've participated in several of those.
Right.
So those are the volunteers. And then there's the people that are in amateur radio clubs that are ARRL affiliated clubs. And so when you break it all down, there's thousands upon thousands of volunteers. And that is really the core of the ARRL, are its volunteers. Now, I happen to be a paid staff member. Somebody has to do the work.
Right.
And so the ARRL is also publishers of technical material. There's a monthly magazine for its members. The ARRL is membership-based, and they have roughly 170,000 members. There's about 750,000 radio amateurs in the United States and over 3 million worldwide and climbing. So it's an expanding radio service worldwide. But as I say, we're publishers at the ARRL, and its monthly magazine is QST Magazine.
Right. Being a member, I get that every month.
Yeah, a high-quality magazine. Now, we have other books that we publish. In fact, there's dozens upon dozens of books that the ARRL provides. Probably the most important book is this one here, because if you're interested in becoming a radio amateur, you want to start out with this book. This is the license manual, your technician class license manual. And being a radio amateur, you must be licensed by the FCC.
That's right.
And there's reasons for that because, well, radio waves have no boundaries. And so imagine if you started calling people names in another country. It would be an international incident. Also, the amateur radio frequency bands, you must stay within the certain frequencies, certain areas of the radio spectrum, starting from just above the AM broadcast band all the way up through light. They're all spaced out at equal intervals. But you have to know the rules and regulations, what frequencies you operate on, and proper operating etiquette. So you're licensed and have to take a test, so at least you know those basic things.
Right, and the testing is done through ARRL and other organizations by groups called VEs, and Bob and I are both volunteer examiners.
Yep.
Yes. And we actually get our volunteer credentials through the ARRL. And then we do the testing, in our case, the group I'm with, on a monthly basis. And they're talk about the 3 different levels of licenses that are available, Bob.
Well, you start out with a technician class license, and it's basic electronics, your important rules and regulations, what frequencies that you're operating on, just so you can stay out of trouble and hopefully, you know, make sure that you watch out for overhead wires, for instance, things like that, basic safety things. But the technician class is your entry-level license. It allows you to operate on all frequencies, all amateur frequencies above 50 megahertz. So that's 50 to 54 megahertz, 144 to 148, 222 to 225, 420 to 450. Can I go on?
You know,
there are many.
It goes up a long way.
Way up into the microwave, so you can really experiment with some really neat stuff. But also the technician class license allows radio amateurs to have some shortwave phone privileges. When I say shortwave, shortwaves are radio signals that you can actually bounce off the ionosphere, which is one of the layers of the upper atmosphere that acts as a mirror for radio waves on a certain range of frequencies. So the technician class licensee has 10 meters available to them. They have some digital communications on that band, but they also have Morse code privileges on other amateur bands, HF bands, so you can talk farther away. So you're saying, oh, I have to learn Morse code being a technician. No, there's no requirement to know Morse code anymore. Used to be, but no more. But if you want to learn Morse code, or if you want to buy the right software for your computer that'll send and receive it, tied to your ham radio, you can do the Morse code that way.
Now, Bob, the next step up then is the general class.
The general class gives you more frequencies to operate on. Specifically, it gives you access to every high-frequency shortwave band. So that's 160, well, that's technically medium frequency, but 160, 80, 60 meters, 40 meters,
Right.
30, 20, 17, 15, 12, and all of 10 meters.
Right.
So that opens up. Now, you don't get all of the frequencies on each band, but you get a lot more privileges, and it really opens up the world to you. You can talk internationally on a regular basis.
The test is a little more complex, a little more technical
Yes.
involved in that.
And the higher in class and license you go, it's going to be more and more difficult. But that's the best part. If you have an open mind and you like to learn, you're going to be self-taught in electronics.
Yes.
And radio propagation, how radios work, physics a bit, how antennas work, and you're going to gain a general knowledge of radio technology. And that's what's really special. Now you can say, oh, I don't want to be self-taught. Well, guess what? There's amateur radio classes locally everywhere.
Right.
And you can go to a class and there'll be people that have been in it for a while that'll help you out to learn all about it. It's called being an Elmer. Like I've helped a lot of people out in amateur radio. I'm considered an Elmer. So you really don't have to learn all by yourself if you don't want to. You can get involved with other people and other radio amateurs, and they'll help you along. Then there's the extra class. Extra class is, again, more complicated electronically. You're going to have to know how to at least run your scientific calculator,
Yes.
sine, cosines, and things like that. But if you know how to press the buttons on your calculator, you can actually get through that okay. And so there's a written test for extra class. Extra class allows you all amateur frequencies. So it's all before you.
And along with that, I might add, you can then become a volunteer examiner to
Yes.
be able to give the test. I'm an extra, you're an extra, of course. I am a fairly new ham. I've only been a ham about four and a half years now.
You've done very well.
I've been a commercially licensed broadcast engineer for many years prior to that, so the technical side wasn't it. I had to relearn a little of this
Sure.
over time and then get used to all of these frequencies. Broadcasters tend not to do that.
Yep.
But it was so much fun for me. It was such a great mental exercise. Something to do when I retired, and that's how I got into it. A friend of mine said, you're going to need something to occupy your time. You're leaving your career. And he was right.
Yep.
And I like public events. I'm Skywarn active, and we'll talk a little more about that in a little while. But there is something for everybody. If you're interested in radio, interested in communications, it is so incredibly vast. Everything from talking to the International Space Station,
Yeah, those astronauts are hams too.
right, to doing a
Most of them, yeah.
parade, to long distance communications, DXing, contesting. There's just so much to it.
Yes, and it's actually just about impossible to learn all about every single facet of amateur radio because it's so vast. But one thing, amateur radio has had an important part of history. And
Very
all
good.
the major technological develops that we enjoy today were actually developed first in some radio amateur's basement or their garage.
Yes. Very definitely. And we have some examples from new to old technology
Sure.
that you brought with us today.
Well, yeah, I brought a civil defense radio from the late 1950s. I'm 1959 vintage myself. Been a radio amateur for 42 years. But here goes. Here's what radios were like when I was born. So I'm going to reach over and here we go. Oh. This is what's called a Gonset communicator. Operates on only one band, the 2-meter amateur band. You couldn't really change the transmit frequency very easily because it's crystal controlled. There's a receiver window here, tuning up, things like that, transmit, receive, switch. But this was used in just about every municipality for emergency communications.
Right.
Remember, amateur radio is really primarily important for emergency communications. So this was a civil defense radio. Has the stickers on the side.
I love the sticker and the color.
Yeah,
on
the
this.
microphone goes in the back. It has tubes. It has high voltage. Don't get it wet, whatever you do. But look how massive this radio is.
Yes.
And it can only transmit on a couple of channels selected by crystals. But yet this was very, very important, especially during the Cold War.
Oh, definitely.
And there were things called fallout shelters back then.
I worked at a radio station that had one of those in there and had that radio.
Had that radio, and they also had this device here, the Geiger counter.
Yes.
Now, this is also from that same vintage. So if you had the Allison communicator, you also were ready with your Geiger counter to check for radiation. You'd have this probe that you'd open the door crack and then put the probe out and close the door and then read your Geiger counter. And if it was reading anything, don't go outside because crispy critters.
Yes, yes.
So, but I just showed you that very, very old radio, but we have this now. This is a two-way, actually a dual-band radio.
Right.
It's very small, and it can operate on a wide variety of amateur frequencies, battery-powered, no power cord. That's how we've gone. The technology has gotten smaller and smaller. And so,
And somebody's going to ask me, somebody's going to be thinking this out there. Okay, in dollars, how expensive was that compared to one of these radios?
oh, that's a
back
very
then?
good question. The Allison communicators weren't cheap. They were very, very well built and very rugged, but very serviceable. Now, the radio operator who had that had a good chance of fixing it
Right.
if things broke. With that said, the price of a Allison communicator was probably around the vicinity of $250.
And
That's
was
in 1960s dollars. So you
yeah.
can imagine with inflation, you're probably looking at a couple $1,000
Yes.
today. For something that's not very frequency agile, heavy, and must be plugged into the wall. Now we take a little itty bitty radio. You can get these on Amazon.
Yeah.
A little itty bitty thing. This does comply with FCC harmonic and
does.
spurious emission limits. Yes, this one
Okay.
does. Okay, but this little radio costs about $30 in today's. Now this is okay. This is a basic radio, but I did bring another radio that is made by a major manufacturer, Yaesu, and this one does a lot more.
Yes.
Okay, it operates on 4 different amateur bands. So you need your technician class license to transmit on one. And it has a built-in GPS. So I know exactly what my location is, what direction I'm going, and how fast. And it also has an automatic beacon setting that I turn it on, and this pings another amateur radio receiver, and then puts me, using software, puts me on a map as a locator. So if I'm lost, I could turn on my beacon and someone can find me.
And we have had that happen in real life many times.
Yes.
That's happened. I'm going to pick up mine right now. This is my latest radio. This is a digital radio. This is a little bit different. This is a new technology. And Bob, I know that the ARRL is looking at these as well.
Yes.
I've just gotten into this. It's fairly technical, but it's an extremely powerful radio in that with the system nationwide, I can talk anywhere in the country with this. In fact, anywhere in the world
That's correct.
equipped for it. Its primary usage, in my estimation, or that I'm going to use it for, is for public service. This is something that they're shifting to more and more. But you might talk to a little bit more about this new service.
Well, that's called DMR, and it's called made by Motorola, perfected by Motorola, and Moto Turbo it's called. There are other companies building the transceivers, but basically it's an amateur radio that you transmit to what's called a repeater. Now a repeater is a device that picks up your radio signal and then retransmits it over a wider area. Now amateur radio repeaters have been around a long time, more than 50 years. So that part of it isn't new. What is different about Moto Turbo here is that each repeater is tied to the internet.
Right.
And so now you have a whole web of repeaters all tied together. Now, in Connecticut, we have Amateur Radio Emergency Service, ARES. Connecticut ARES has an operating system using Moto Turbo DMR repeaters. They're all tied together, and they're very, very, very close to having the ability of using a handheld and being able to hit any one of those repeaters. There's 27 of them in Connecticut with a handheld.
Right.
So imagine that you have statewide coverage in an emergency with one of those. Now, they have one little footnote to that is that it is tied to the internet.
Right.
So if the internet goes down, you're very local.
Right.
You're back to your local
Right,
repeater
right,
again.
right.
But there's other amateur radio frequencies to use that would give you that statewide coverage.
Certainly.
Yep.
And we train on these because I am an ARIES member. And in fact, I use this same radio I just showed you Sunday night for the ARIES digital net, which follows the standard net in which everybody
analog net.
statewide
Yep.
checks in, analog. I use my base radio at my house for the analog side. I literally sit in my basement with this little radio and can do the entire statewide net with the digital radio. And it's a new service. It's another layer, another tool in that giant toolbox we call amateur radio. And, I'm fascinated with it. And but you see how the technology has gone from vacuum tubes.
Yep.
And it's not been that long ago, Bob.
No. Well, really, vacuum tubes sort of started going out in the mid-'70s. So imagine that little antenna that you can hit a wide coverage with. And many people are afraid about the antennas that radios are tied to. Oh, I have to have a big tower. My neighbors are going to hate me. Or I live in a condominium. Well, one of the nice things about the ARRL is that they're publishers, of course, of technical material. One of their books is called Indoor Antenna, or Antennas for Small Places, basically. It's a book about what to do if you're not allowed to have all these gigantic antennas. So you can actually put them in your attic, for instance. You can have portable antennas. Or if you can have outside antennas, they don't have to be a monstrosity big tower. They can be very stealthy antennas that no one would notice, made out of wire. Now, I have a good friend who actually loads up a gutter and downspout as an antenna, and he works the world using a gutter and downspout that's on the house. And nobody really knows that he's an amateur radio operator.
Sure.
But you don't have to have those monstrosities. They do help when you have one, but you don't have to have that big antenna. And certainly, look at this little small antenna. I can hit a repeater from where I live, which is in way up in the northwest corner of Massachusetts, Mount Greylock, with this little thing. And from here, I could get into Lake George, New York, into Vermont, parts of New Hampshire, all of Massachusetts with this little thing. And it's very handy.
Now, let's talk a little bit about what you do at the ARRL, Bob. You're a test engineer.
Yes, I'm a test engineer, and what that involves is testing amateur radio products. Now, in our QST magazine, one of the most read columns every month is QST product review. And basically, it's like a consumer reports for amateur radio. And what we do as an organization is we publish these product reviews, but we get membership feedback. What do our members want to see reviewed in QST? So they let us know. And then we purchase that piece of equipment off the shelf. In other words, the manufacturer doesn't give us equipment to test. We decide what to test and what to publish. Of course, the manufacturer is involved, especially if there's any issues that we find in the laboratory, and that happens quite a bit. And so after I do the testing, the first round of testing, I share all my data with the manufacturer. So what do I test? Well, for instance, this radio is rated at 2 watts RF output power. Now I'll put that into a specialized piece of equipment, a watt meter, and I will see if it actually puts out 2 watts. How sensitive, how weak of a signal can you hear with the receiver in this? Another thing that I test. But actually there's a very, very, very long list of data that things that I measure for amateur radio equipment. We also measure amplifiers, power amplifiers. The maximum legal limit is 1,500 watts. You can do a lot with that amount of power.
Right, yes.
But there's quite a bit of testing that's involved. I share that data with the manufacturer. If I find issues, I let them know about it. And they're grateful because now they have that opportunity to make that radio, whatever device it is, better.
Yes.
So the ARRL actually has a direct impact on the advancement of technology in this regard.
And I find that fascinating and a tremendous service. In our last few moments, I'd like to talk a bit about how someone can get more information or become knowledgeable about amateur radio.
Sure.
I'm going to make my first pitch for the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum. We have our own ham club there and many amateurs. And of course, Bob is actually one of our members and active there as well. But you could learn about amateur radio. We actually have a technician's class starting up in a few weeks because this show is done on a time base. I'm not going to mention the dates, but there are clubs. There is the Bloomfield Amateur Radio Club. I happen to be the president of that club at this point in time. We are VEs and we give tests once a month. But there are places to learn about this. But one of the most important is headquarters.
Is the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League. You can go to the website to check out what the ARRL does, and it's www.arrl.org. www.arrl.org. That'll hook you up, and you can actually go to our shopping page, and this is what you're going to want to try to pick up. It's the license manual. It's for the technician class license. In this book is all the learning material that you'll need to know for obtaining your technician class license. Plus, it has all the questions that you might be asked on the exam. So it has the questions and it has the answers. So you can study a chapter, take a couple of quiz questions in the back, find the answers and see if you got them right. Then you move on to the next chapter. So this is a wonderful way to learn with the help of others too.
Very definitely.
You know, but that's a good way to get into the license. But you need that license to transmit.
I used these manuals all the way through my extra class, but they also have software that goes with it.
Yes.
And that's very, very important. Bob, we're rapidly running out of time.
Amazing, this went so quickly.
Yes, it did. And I
could talk for hours.
Yes, I certainly
I got a lot of old buzzard stories to tell.
Well, we'll probably have you back. We'll have to have a situation.
Okay, if you like the show, write to Dan here, okay?
But anyway, we really appreciate you taking the time out.
Thank you very
I know
much.
you are busy. Bob also, by the way, has a book that he has written at ARRL as well. That is all we have time for today. I would certainly again like to thank Bob Allison, WB1 GCM. That's his call. I'm Dan Thomas, your host. NC1J. That's my call, and I'm proud of it.
Thank you.
And again, thank you for joining us for this issue of Common Point. Have a good day.
Pepsi-Cola, it's the pot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much to do. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you. Nickel, 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 nickel. Pepsi-Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.